Good morning, everybody. I can see that there are about 140 of you here already. It's 11 o'clock on the dot, but we might just give another couple of minutes for the stragglers to come. We had 200 plus registrations for this webinar, and I know there's been quite a lot of interest in it. So given that a good number have joined just in the last couple of minutes, I think we'll just leave it 2 or 3 more minutes and then we'll make a start. I hope that's okay. I could probably use this time actually to tell you that there is a Q&A function on Zoom. I'm sure in these dog days of the lockdown, you're all well aware of the functionality of Zoom. But one of the things that the Q&A function allows you to do is to ask us questions as we're speaking, which has the joint effect or the dual effect of both completely distracting us and meaning that we lose our train of thought mid-sentence, which is always fun, but also allows you to respond to the things that we're saying and question them. So please, we've got a lot of questions that have been pre-submitted, for which thank you very much, but please, if as we go through things occur to you or you just want to see Ashley Bowes floundering because he's been distracted, then please feel free to do that via the Q&A. Okay, that's both 1104 and 200 attendees, including us panelists, but that feels like a good point at which to make a start. So Rob and Ashley, are you going to come on video just so at least we can see your faces? There's Ashley, and Rob is going to come in a minute. There he is. Very good. First of all, thank you to Max Short, who not only has submitted 2 very good and searching questions, but has also just reminded me by email that I've forgotten to do what I usually do before a webinar, which is take down the portrait of my father, which hangs behind me, in order to avoid increasingly awkward questions about how much I look like him. He's 50 years older than me, or was. I forgot to take that down. Thank you for the reminder, Max. I'm not going to take it down, so he's going to watch over this webinar with us. I hope nobody minds. It's a great picture. So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about primarily a consent order that the Secretary of State signed in a case called the Willows, in which I acted for the claimant local authority as a Section 288 claim. The 3 of us, you can see there, Porthos, Athos and Aramis, or if you just click on Rob, you can see that actually that's not quite who we are. I'm going to talk about the case itself, what exactly the concession means, how it all came together, and what do we take away from it. And then when I'm done, Rob Williams is going to talk about some sort of slightly wider implications of housing land supply decisions in the last short while. How do we go about collating and judging the evidence before Ashley Bowes brings us home on this relay with some thoughts about how we deal with the COVID-19 pandemic and its likely, expected, possible, unknown effect on housing delivery and how that feeds into the housing land supply debate. Do you want to just advance, Rob, one more slide? I'm going to start with the background, but this will be old news for an awful lot of you. What we're really talking about here with this case, the Willows or Thrapston or whatever we want to call it, is the general requirement on local authorities to demonstrate a 5-year supply of deliverable sites. Now, that's not a new requirement. I think that predates the NPPF even. It was a requirement that existed in PPS 3. But in 2012, the NPPF made it a formal requirement of national policy in this sense. We were required, local authorities were required, everybody was required to consider the 5-year supply of, and the definition is there, available now, suitable location for development now, and achievable with a realistic prospect that housing will be delivered on site within 5 years. Those words we'll come back to, and then also that they're viable. And in 2012, the framework said that the way one should approach sites was that sites with planning permission, non-specific as to whether outline or full, should be considered deliverable until permission expires, unless there's clear evidence that they won't be implemented. So if you like, a general presumption that if you've got some kind of planning permission on a site, those sites will be considered to be deliverable unless someone could come along with clear evidence and show that they're not deliverable. There was then the case of, this is all old news, the case of St Modwen, in which Mr Justice Ouseley at first instance gave a very clear exposition of that definition, basically reminding us all that deliverable is not the same as certainty, doesn't require certainty, and doesn't require that all units on all sites be delivered. Drew the distinction there between the counting of sites that are actually delivered and the assessment of whether they're deliverable. We just go to the next slide. Mr Justice Ouseley, of course, was upheld in the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal said, basically summarising what Mr Justice Ouseley had said, deliverability is not the same thing as delivery. The fact that a particular site is capable of being delivered within 5 years doesn't mean it necessarily will be, and then making the point that planning doesn't deal in certainties and local planning authorities don't control the housing market. So sites that might be deliverable may well not end up delivering housing, and that's fine. That's well within the definition. And then, of course, the 2018 NPPF, which is now the 2019 NPPF, came along, although this didn't change between those two, and tightened things up. Post St Modwen, there was a feeling that the balance had been, I was going to say tilted, but I won't use that, shifted slightly in favour of local authorities, you might say, in that what they had to show was this realistic prospect and no more. But the 2018 and now 2019 iteration of the NPPF tightened that up, and this is the definition with which the Willows case was concerned. So the first bit is exactly the same. Available now, suitable location, development now, achievable with a realistic prospect, be delivered on site within 5 years. But then it says, in particular, and we'll come back to those words, and you have two categories, category A and category B. So that's the definition with which we've been grappling since the 2018 version of the NPPF. Just honing in on the two categories, the issue that was raging long before the Willows case came along was whether categories A and B provided a comprehensive and closed list of all the types of site that could in principle be considered deliverable. But it left out, of course, if you have a look at A and B, it leaves out, of course, sites, and these are just examples, sites with a resolution to grant planning permission, where the committee has considered the application and resolved to grant pursuant to, for example, a fairly straightforward Section 106 agreement, about which provisions there is no controversy, but it's just a matter of time before it's signed. It certainly leaves out draft allocations in emerging plans, which in some cases have gone through quite a comprehensive site sift, and it might be said that some of those are fairly far along the the planning process. And it also, of course, leaves out kind of unusual ad hoc sites that come forward unexpectedly, so on and so forth. So if categories A and B were a comprehensive and closed list of the types of sites that could be considered deliverable, then all of those sites would be left out. And there are a couple of cases, for some reason there's a spate of cases with the word wool in, all of which concern this. I have no idea why. Both Woolpit and Woolmagreen plumped for the closed list analysis of that definition. So even if you had a site with a resolution to grant, and it was fairly clear that the section 106 was not going to hold things up, but it was just a matter of time, you couldn't take it into account as a matter of principle. That's the closed list argument. And then along came the Willows. Now that's a picture of Thrapston Bridge, which if you look on TripAdvisor is the second most popular visitor attraction in Thrapston. I won't tell you what the first one is. I'll leave you with a tantalising prospect that it's a visit to the Willows, which is a small conurbation of houses, but you can go and check TripAdvisor yourself. That's Thrapston Bridge. The Willows was I think a blog somewhere called it a fairly nondescript case, which hasn't turned out to be, but it's often the case. It was an application for 4 houses that was refused by the local authority for various reasons, went to appeal and was heard at a hearing at which the appellant was represented by counsel, but the council was not represented. In any event, the hearing proceeded, and the inspector found that the proposal for 4 houses was contrary to the development plan. It was outside the settlement boundaries and would undermine the spatial strategy to permit development there, but that there was no harm to the character and appearance of the area. But on the 5-year supply, he found, Graham Chamberlain was the inspector, found that the council had no 5-year supply. And he found it on the very straightforward basis that the definition of deliverable site was a closed list, and the council had included in their schedule of deliverable sites, of their housing land supply, if you like, 774 units that didn't, on sites which didn't fall within any of the types of site listed in category A or B. Now, they were a combination of emerging allocations and some brownfield sites and so on and so forth. The detail doesn't really matter because the inspector at the hearing didn't go any further than saying, well, look, those are out, they're not within any of the types listed within category A and B. And as such, it's we're not even going to consider them. We're not going to look at the evidence. So he found slightly disturbing GIF here. The point I'm making here is that the Willows was if you like, a pure case on the closed list. There was no issue about need. The 774 units that were on non-category A or B sites were excluded as a point of principle. The inspector said, if they're not in category A or B, if they're not on sites in types described in category A or B, then they're out without looking at the evidence. I'm not even interested in talking about them. No assessment of their individual features. And what's more, once as a matter of arithmetic, he'd removed 774 sites from East Northant's proposed supply, just as a matter of arithmetic, they could no longer show a 5-year supply. So he ended the conversation there. Now, I should say, if anyone was involved in the case, there are some sort of factual frills around the edges, which I'm just glossing over, partly because it allows me to use that GIF. But there was some debate about the extent to which the local authority actually conceded that it was a closed list. But I won't get into that now because it actually doesn't matter at all. Then the matter came to me. East Northants came and asked me for advice on challenging it. And we took a Section 288 challenge. What I missed saying, and what I should have said, is that not only did the inspector, this is really a purity point, not only did the inspector say closed list, therefore 774 units come out of the supply, therefore you can't demonstrate a 5-year supply even if everything else goes your way. He also said that it was so unreasonable for the council to have proceeded on the basis that it was not a closed list and included 774 sites in their trajectory, in their supply. It was so unreasonable to have done that as a matter of principle that he made a costs order against the council too. So there was a real purity to the case. We challenged both the substantive decision to grant planning permission. Again, I think what I missed out was that having found we had no 5-year supply, or the council had no 5-year supply, I wasn't involved at that point, the inspector found that the tilted balance meant that notwithstanding the conflict with the development plan, permission should be granted. Now, on the closed list point, we went to the High Court and said a bunch of things. First of all, that the ordinary meaning of the NPPF glossary, which is where this definition is found, suggests that it's not a closed list. And without going on about it too much, basically the point being made was that the definition of deliverability is actually the first part of the entry in the glossary, and that was exactly the same as was dealt with by St Modwen, albeit in the 2012 NPPF, and therefore Ousley, J and Court of Appeal observations on those words, not requiring certainty, so on and so forth, applied. But A and B, categories A and B, are not part of the definition. They are ways into that definition. So one is a gateway. A, category A, reads as if you're this kind of site, you don't need to show evidence, you're presumed to be deliverable unless. And category B is a gate against entry, which is that if you're one of these types of sites, you're presumed not to be deliverable unless you can show evidence, clear evidence that you are. But both of those are ways into the definition, which is the first bit, the available now, etc. So that was the first point. That was a kind of textual point. The second point was that the purpose and context of the NPPF suggested that it was an open list. Again, just summarising, no requirement for certainty. We know that from St Modwen. The question, and this is, I think, sometimes what gets forgotten, if one takes a step back and asks what are we trying to do here, the question is to ask ourselves whether supply of housing land is likely to be a constraint to the delivery of houses in future. That's what we're really talking about. And if it is, so if there isn't going to be enough housing land to provide enough houses for people to live in who need them, then the planning system should respond. And so a reading of it that ruled out site types which on the evidence would contribute to that kind of supply, i.e. help to stop supply being a constraint to delivery, why wouldn't you want to take those into account? And if you did interpret it as a closed list, it would provide or might provide some absurd results. And for example, the situation where there had been a resolution to grant full planning permission at a committee, subject only to the signing of a section 106, which had then been negotiated. Everybody was agreed, but one of the people who had to sign the section 106 happened to be out of the country for a short time, couldn't sign it, but everybody knew they were going to sign it on their return. But in the meantime, there was a planning inquiry. A closed list interpretation says that you can't take that site and its contribution to supply into account. An open list said, well, of course you can, because on evidence that would be a sensible inclusion in the supply. And the third point was a sort of slight red herring, which is that the inspector had said in his decision that one of the reasons, or in fact what he says is the reason that he treats it as a closed list, is that case law, counsel for the appellant, as then was, had shown him case law that said that it was a closed list. Now, as it turns out, that just wasn't right. There is no case law to that effect, and I think counsel for the appellant would agree that he hadn't shown any case law of that type. So the third point was that the inspector had just gone at it the wrong way. Now, it's important to understand the timeline here. What happened was we issued the claim, and before we heard from the Secretary of State, and before we heard from the court as to permission, the interested party, the developer, who'd been the appellant in the hearing, settled their acknowledgement of service. And they sent it both to the Secretary of State and to us, obviously, and it was a detailed and comprehensive repudiation of the claim. It took on all the points that I've just run through and made all the points that go the other way. And then shortly after that, the Secretary of State wrote to us and said that they would contest the claim, having seen the interested parties' grounds. So no question but the Secretary of State understood what the controversy was. And then shortly after that, Mr. Justice Lewis granted permission, having seen the interested parties in acknowledgement of service, but also the Secretary of State's intended concession. But the key point to note here is that this wasn't a concession that was made blindly, and it wasn't permission that was granted blindly. The interested party, represented by relatively experienced planning counsel, had put in comprehensive grounds, which, apart from that factual frill that I told you about concession, took on the 3 points that I made, but made the case that the closed list interpretation was, as a matter of law, the correct one. First of all, use of language and those words in particular. The point being made there was that words in particular before categories A and B show that it should be a closed list. Made the point that I don't know attracts quite a lot of people, that if A and B provide evidential thresholds, so A, presumption that you're deliverable unless evidence against, B, presumption that you're not unless clear evidence in favour, well, what then of category C or non-category sites? There's no evidential threshold. That seems strange. That militates against an open list interpretation. And then thirdly, a point was made that the PPG rather supports the interpretation of the NPPF glossary definition as being a closed list, in that it uses the word namely before it goes on to describe the site types. So as I say, comprehensive grounds of resistance which were in front of the Secretary of State before the consent order was signed, and indeed in front of Mr. Justice Lewis before he granted permission, for what that's worth. Then there was a back and forth between the Council and the Secretary of State about the terms of the concession, which resulted in, and I know lots of you would have seen the consent order, it's certainly been circulating, but in the normal way, it has the nuts and bolts of the order, Secretary of State concedes, so on and so forth, and then it has a statement of reasons, which is increasingly what the Secretary of State is expected to and does do. And the statement of reasons include this at B, and I say immediately that those words were drafted not very far away from where I'm sitting now and sent to the Secretary of State for his approval, and he agreed to them. The defendant has carefully considered his decision, concedes that he erred in his interpretation of the definition of deliverable in the NPPF as a closed list. It is not, can't be much clearer. And then the proper definition is that any site which can be shown to be, and then those words, will meet the definition, and that the examples given in A and B are not exhaustive. So not much room for doubt there about what the Secretary of State was conceding. It's not a closed list, not much grey area. So what do we take from that before I hand over to Rob to widen things? Well, the first point is, for the lawyers in the room and most of the planners, a fairly obvious one. A concession by the Secretary of State followed by a consent order is not citable in any way. It's not a binding precedent. It doesn't bind anyone at all or decide anything. We would have very much liked to have gone to court, of course, and have it decided. It would have been a fun case to argue. I'm sure my opponent would have thought the same, but we didn't get there because the Secretary of State took the view that he did, and then the developer followed in that, albeit not signing up to the reasoning. So first point is, it didn't decide anything, but I think there is something more to say about that. It is a very clear, if I may say so, exposition of the Secretary of State's view of this particular controversy. There isn't any room for doubt. And of course, the Secretary of State is, if you like, the author and guardian, in theory, of the NPPF. So what the Secretary of State thinks his own policy means is itself highly relevant, if not determinative of a question. But I think the bigger point is that it's what the Secretary of State wants it to mean, because if the Secretary of State wanted to fight the case, it seems to me that it was arguable either way. There were certainly arguments running either way, and the Secretary of State could have said, well, let's have this decided. But what I take from the concession is that the Secretary of State decided that he wanted this to be determined in the way that I've just described. And of course, don't forget that in every planning appeal, an inspector, albeit not bound by that concession, is effectively acting on behalf of the Secretary of State, and is likely to face a challenge if that inspector departs from what we now know is the Secretary of State's clear view on the definition of deliverable. So what do we take from all of that? And this is really the nub of an awful lot of questions that you asked, lots of you asked in advance of today. The question just falls back to this, and I think this is really important to understand, that the question is whether a site is deliverable on the evidence, i.e. whether it's available now, suitable, so on and so forth. And categories A and B are evidential presumptions that you can and should apply in respect of certain types of sites in coming to the answer, is this site deliverable? They don't themselves define what is and isn't deliverable. I think we're going to, in all of the talks today, we're going to come back to this question, that this is really or points to, along with a bunch of other things, a return to what Lord Justice Lindblom has been saying for a long time in more or less every case he ever decides, which is that we should get back to planning judgment on all of these questions and move away from overly mechanistic, dare I say, legalistic rules to rule in or rule out things. What's really important is the exercise of planning judgment. What we've got here now, I think, is a situation following the Willows where planning judgment needs to be applied in respect of sites rather than a reliance on lists and exclusions and inclusions. So I think that's all I want to say at the moment, but of course I'm going to hang around for questions. I think we're going to move over to Rob, or Robert as he calls himself in his slides now.
Thanks, Joe. And I should start with an apology which I think Ashley owes you too, and that's for our lockdown perms that we're sporting. You'll be glad to know, certainly for my part, that I've got a barber's appointment at midday tomorrow, and can only hope that they've got some shears available ready to cut this. And a plug for a local plans webinar we've got next week, next Thursday. If you come then, you'll see me cleanly shaven. But I'm going to be talking primarily about a relatively narrow issue, but one which is regularly debated at planning inquiries in context of the 5-year supply. It's to what extent, if at all, can you take into account factors which arise after the base date? Now, what do I mean? What do we mean by the base date? I'm sure it's very familiar to you all. Simply put, it's the date on which the 5-year period with which you are concerned starts. So if you're calculating the 5-year supply today, you're unlikely to use the period 3rd of July 2020 to the 2nd of July 2025. You'd calculate it from a fixed point in time, a base date. And base dates tend to be taken from the 1st of April each year, but there's no requirement, even in policy, for that. It's entirely a matter of judgment. So if you're calculating the 5-year supply today, it's likely to be considering a 5-year period from the 1st of April 2020 to the 31st of March 2025. And you're asking yourself, how many dwellings have a realistic prospect of being delivered in that 5-year period? And you're doing so notwithstanding the fact you're already 3 months into that period. And it's not unusual, of course, at appeals to be 6 months or 9 months into that period when you're asking that question. So that raises the question, what can you take into account in terms of factors which have arisen after the base date? And an early decision on this was the Woolpit decision of Inspector Stevens. And it's fair to say he took a pretty hardline approach to this issue. In effect, he said nothing which happens after the base date can be relied upon. And in particular, he said, firstly, local planning authorities can only rely on the evidence that they produced in their AMR or equivalent as demonstrating deliverability. Secondly, he said you can't take into account evidence which postdates the base date to retrospectively justify inclusion of sites as deliverable. And thirdly, he says what you definitely can't do is to take account of grants of permission which postdate the base date. And it's fair to say that Woolpit has cast a long shadow over the debate about deliverability. It is referred to in virtually all inquiries I've been involved with concerning 5-year supply. And Joe and I spoke about this issue because we're really boring types and only ever talk about housing land supply. We must get away from it, Joe, next planning day. We spoke about it last November and we identified 4 potential propositions that could be derived then from 2 cases that Joe referred to, Walmer Green and Woolpit. And for propositions 1 and 4, which you can see on the screen there, we said, watch this space. We expected further developments on those issues. For propositions 2 and 3, we said we think Woolpit was wrong. And we'll come on to explore what's happened since in a moment. But the first thing to deal with is the Secretary of State's decision handed down last week on the 25th of June, the Woburn Sands decision. And that was an application for residential development of just over 200 dwellings. And there was, as is often the case, a dispute over 5 years supply, and the appellant relied on Woolpit as authority for the proposition that it's necessary to look at what evidence existed at the base date and to ask whether that is sufficient to demonstrate, or was sufficient to demonstrate, deliverability. The appellant said in their closing submissions, it's not methodologically sound to deem a site as deliverable and then to justify that retrospectively by reference to later evidence. The inspector rejected the appellant's arguments, and I've set out the central reasons he did so in his report there. He said, firstly, there's nothing in the NPPF or the NPPG that stipulates the documentary evidence must be available at the base date. Secondly, the PPG advocates the use of latest available evidence. He drew an analogy with the annual position statement and the ability of local planning authorities to prepare and consult on APSs after the base date. And he referred to previous appeal decisions, including by the Secretary of State, which hadn't followed the Woolpit decision in that respect. And therefore, the inspector concluded in his report that it was acceptable that evidence can post-date the base date, provided it is used to support sites identified as deliverable as of, and then the base date in question in that case. And the Secretary of State agreed with his inspector in terms saying the Secretary of State agrees with the inspector that it is acceptable that the evidence can post-date the base date, provided it's used to support sites identified as deliverable as of the base date. As an aside, there was also an issue in this case as to what extent pro formas could be relied upon and what weight could be given pro formas when demonstrating deliverability. And unsurprisingly, both the inspector and the Secretary of State found that in principle, pro formas could be relied upon as a basis for demonstrating deliverability. Now that, to my mind, is wholly unsurprising. There is no restriction in law or policy on the form or type of evidence that can be taken into account. The real question is the cogency of the content of that evidence, not its form. So let's recap. Closed lists, for practical purposes, for the reasons Joe's given, I think the answer is clear there. There are lawyers amongst us, no doubt, and there will be those who continue to run the argument and rightly say the consent order is not binding and inspectors are not bound by it. But as a matter of practicality, it would take a bold inspector to depart from the Secretary of State's clear indication in that case, because if a challenge is brought on that case, it would appear that the Secretary of State would just concede so long as that matter was determined. But we were asked a question by Graham Ritchie of Wolf-Bond Planning, which relates to the second and third propositions. And he asks, for any site relied upon within the deliverable supply, how important is it that the evidence of delivery must relate to that which is readily known at the base date, or is it reasonable to include subsequent updates? And although there's no binding authority in terms of court authority in relation to it, the majority of inspector decisions and Secretary of State's decisions conclude that the propositions 2 and 3 from Woolpit are wrong, that it is reasonable to include subsequent updates after the base date, which are probative of a site's deliverability. And you can, in effect, bolster the evidence of deliverability by evidence which has emerged after the base date. And Woburn Sands is the most recent example of that, but by no means the only example of it. For what it's worth, and for reasons I'll come on to when we talk about the fourth proposition, I think that approach must be correct. So on to the fourth proposition. Is it permissible to include permissions granted after the base date? Can you include sites which arise after the base date which weren't included in the original assessment as being deliverable? And Woburn Sands appears to confirm that the ghost of Woolpit lives on. You cannot on Woburn Sands approach take into account permissions granted after base date. Indeed, reading Woburn Sands, it appears to me that it suggests as a matter of principle that additional evidence which is available after the base date can be used to bolster an assessment that a site is deliverable, where that site was originally identified as deliverable by the LPA. But additional evidence cannot be used to change an assessment of deliverability from a site that was considered undeliverable to a site that's now considered deliverable. Now, for my part, I can't see how that distinction stands up to scrutiny. If you can take into account evidence which arises after the base date, why can't you move from a category of undeliverability to a category of deliverability rather than just bolstering the conclusion you've come to already that it is deliverable? And there are a number of reasons, in my view, and I frankly say this is my view, and I accept that there are a weight of decisions that go the other way in relation to this. But I think that if the argument is run, and if it's run like in the East Northampton's case before the High Court in an appropriate case, there is at least a risk of challenge on this basis to the proposition you can't include permissions granted after the base date. Now, running through this briefly, the starting point for my purposes, and the most important point, is that there's a general and well-established public law principle that decision makers are entitled to take account of relevant considerations at the date of their decision. So if a new piece of evidence, perhaps not available at the base date, demonstrates that a site which wasn't considered deliverable when it was originally considered is now considered deliverable within the same 5-year period, it strikes me as odd and contrary to that general principle that you'd have to leave that out of account. And to that extent, the Woolpit fourth proposition is contrary to that, in my view, general public law principle. So that begs the question, does law or policy require a departure from that general public law principle? And in my view, it doesn't. Law plainly does not. It doesn't deal with this issue. It's all a matter of policy. The NPPF is silent on the issue. And the PPG, as far as I am concerned, is supportive of the proposition you should be using the most up-to-date evidence. And I've cited there the most relevant parts of the PPG. The third point to make is that, in my view, Woolpit is at least arguably based on a false premise. Inspector Stevens' central rationale I've set out there, it was that his concern was that if you included sites beyond the cut-off date, that would skew the data by overinflating the supply without a corresponding adjustment of need. And I think it's at least arguable that that's flawed on two grounds. Firstly, it assumes that updating deliverable sites only operates to inflate supply. But there may be a whole host of reasons why a site which was perfectly properly considered deliverable as of the base date may be rendered undeliverable because of something that's happened in the interim. The most obvious example is if a site with a planning permission was included in deliverable supply and that planning permission is quashed by the courts, that clearly is going to have an effect, or at least is likely to have an effect on its deliverability. No one suggests you shouldn't be able to take that into account. So if you can take into account evidence which moves a site from a deliverable category to an undeliverable category, why, in principle, can you not take into account evidence that moves it from undeliverable to deliverable? The second potential flaw, in my view, is at the heart of Inspector Stevens' concern is that you'd have to undertake a recalculation of the need. But that assumes you're changing the 5-year period in question. Of course, if you are changing the 5-year period in question, then you would have to calculate the need. But if you're keeping the same base date and you're keeping the same 5-year period and just asking, as of today's date, how many units have a realistic prospect of being delivered in that period, then there's no need to adjust the need calculations. The fourth point is that it could potentially lead to absurd results. Now, we all know that absurd results can occur from time to time, even in the best of systems. But courts tend to strive for interpretations that avoid such results. So on a Woolpit approach, one could have a site that everyone agrees there is a realistic prospect of delivering within the 5 years that you're dealing with. But because it wasn't counted originally by the local planning authority, on the Woolpit approach, it simply couldn't be counted. So, for example, you can have a small site for, say, 5 homes, which was granted planning permission in May of this year, so after the April base date. You could have a house builder on board with a proven track record. There could be no pre-commencement conditions. The neighbours could be joyous about the prospect of new lifeblood of housing in their area, and everybody could agree that there's a realistic prospect of it delivering by 2024. But if, for whatever reason, the local planning authority failed to include it within its original assessment, on the Woolpit approach, it couldn't be included. And that might be an extreme example, but it illustrates, in my view, the flaw of drawing hard lines in the sand as to what is and what is not deliverable. And that echoes what Joe was saying at the end of his presentation. The reality is, in my view, it's a question of planning judgment, assessed on a case-by-case basis with reference to the available evidence at the time of the decision. The fifth and final point is that the argument has unintended consequences for those who seek to rely on it when having debates about 5-year housing land supply. Now, of course, and for obvious reasons and understandable reasons, it's relied upon by developers or landowners when they're arguing about 5-year supply at appeals generally. But anyone seeking to rely on the Woolpit proposition has to be careful that he's not hoisted by his own petard. Because the logical conclusion of the argument that you can't take into account permissions granted after the base date as counting towards a 5-year supply is that you can't take the contribution of your own site to that 5-year supply. Just expanding on that, if you're at an appeal and you win and you get permission, the grant will be necessarily after the base date of the 5-year supply that you're talking about. And so on the Woolpit analysis, you can't say, well, my site will contribute to that 5-year supply. So to bring this all together, whether you act for councils or whether you act for the development industry, I would recommend you don't treat Woolpit principle as sacrosanct, at least until it is settled in the courts. If you do rely on the Woolpit principle, that you can't take into account permissions after the base date, and the inspector agrees, there's at least a risk of legal challenge on that basis in a similar way the closed list was challenged in the court. So if you're going to rely on it, I would suggest it's prudent also to engage with the latest evidence as well, and with the question of whether there's a realistic prospect of the units being delivered within the 5-year period which was your concern, and not just rely on the in-principle Woolpit exclusion. With that sort of submission, as it were, I'm pass on to Ashley, who's going to talk about a different subject, deliverability in a COVID-19 world.
Thank you very much, Rob. Hello everybody, and a bit like the last 3 or 4 years of our lives, we can't now have a seminar without talking about COVID. You used to not be able to have a seminar without talking about Brexit. So here is the COVID section of this seminar. And I also have to add an apology that I have no GIFs or funny pictures or anything entertaining at all. It's just going to be a very dry exposition of 3 appeal decisions, bringing the tone right down, I'm afraid. And they're all in the home counties. So first of all, one in Berkshire, or what used to be Berkshire anyway, within Wokingham. And this was fairly early on in the pandemic, and as the effects of lockdown were becoming known, this decision on the 9th of April 2020, the inspector, having heard the inquiry earlier on in the year, expressly invited the parties to submit their views about the effects of COVID, and more particularly the government's response to controlling the pandemic on delivering housing and the 5-year land supply. And both parties, both the council and the developer, submitted evidence about that. And the inspector was persuaded to remove 168 dwellings from the overall supply to account for a number of things. First of all, that there would be likely sites that were physically closed and not developing because of the effects of the lockdown. And secondly, that those sites that were remaining and being open may have difficulties obtaining the necessary materials. There might be supply chain failures. And thirdly, that when things recover and the lockdown is eased, there may then be a reduced consumer confidence, and that may affect delivery. So for all those reasons, Inspector Downs was persuaded to remove 168 dwellings from the supply, but it didn't, as it happened, make any difference to the overall outcome or indeed the 5-year supply figure. So if I have the next slide, please, because this now shows a difference of opinion and a differing approach by the Secretary of State himself. A little bit further on now, about over a month later or so, in Bell's piece in Farnham concerning an application for 65 dwellings, the Secretary of State recovered this appeal and he considered the Wokingham decision expressly. This was cited to him, and he said that he wasn't going to apply a general discount because there was no quantification of potential impacts and there was no evidence about the delivery of specific sites. So if I can put it this way, wasn't persuaded to have a general COVID backcloth to apply a more pessimistic approach to delivery. What was required was specifics. And then third and finally, the next appeal decision concerns Woburn Sands, which Rob was telling you about just earlier. Those astute amongst you will know that this appeal decision is in fact the product of a case called Wavendon Properties Limited in the Secretary of State, where Mr. Justice Dove quashed the original version of this decision because of the Secretary of State's approach to allowing further 5-year land supply evidence in, but it's better known perhaps for its approach to what is the situation where the policies most important for the application are out of date as an engaging trigger for paragraph 11D in the tilted balance. So anyway, with that bit of geekery out of the way, move on to this. And this is fairly recent, last week, 25th of June, and again restating the principle that there should be no reduction in supply because there was no evidence about the deliverability of specific sites and how they would be affected by the government's response to the pandemic. So drawing all that together, I think there's three key lessons that we need to bear in mind. First of all, the MHCLG as part of the government is extremely anxious, I think, to not be seen to endorse a pessimistic economic narrative around COVID-19 and the government's response to it. It doesn't want to be seen to be suggesting in any way that this will have an effect on house building, which, as we know, the government sees as a crucial plank to economic recovery. Secondly, I think there is no real hope, given the Secretary of State has now twice in 2 months restated this, of getting sort of a general COVID discount, saying, well, you should look at housing delivery through a more pessimistic lens just because of the context in which we're in. I think that's highly unlikely to succeed. What might succeed is evidence about specific sites, and that evidence needs to be quantifiable. So, for example, if you had evidence that showed that a particular site had been closed for a period, material period, 2 or 3 months, and then you work that through the deliverable supply trajectory that had been submitted, and there was no evidence to suggest that the developer was taking adjustments to make up the shortfall in the time that they'd lost as a consequence of the lockdown, well, then you might be in a position to say, well, you should reduce the amount of units that will be delivered on that particular site. But the message from the Secretary of State is that the approach that Inspector Downs was persuaded to take in the Wokingham case is not right, and you need to have very clear, specific evidence that's targeted to individual sites that shows how the lockdown is likely going to affect delivery. So with those 3 lessons, we'll turn now to back to Joe and to answer some of your questions that you submitted. Thank you.
Thanks, Ash. That's great. Just before we get to the questions, and there have been some submitted in the course of our talk and also lots submitted in advance, and we'll try and deal with as many of them as we can in the next 10-15 minutes or so. I just want to kind of bring together what I think all 3 of us think is really the conclusion of the things that we've been looking at, which is this return to the idea of judgment and a move away from generalized rules or mechanistic devices for decision making. In my view, the open list approach to that definition simply means that local authorities and the development industry seeking to promote schemes need to apply judgment to the question of how many of the sites in the putative supply are in fact deliverable in fact meet the definition, rather than relying on exclusionary rules or inclusionary rules. Now, that isn't to say, of course, that you can't take advantage of the presumptions that are contained within A and B. Of course, you must do that. But the basic position is, I think, frankly, that if you're a site type within category A, you should still apply some judgment as to whether there's clear evidence that you're, notwithstanding that type of site, you're not deliverable. And all other sites, you should apply some judgment as to whether they do in fact meet the definition. So I think sometimes this is cast as a kind of pro-local authority or a contra development industry or whatever decision. I just don't think it is that at all. I think it's just a nudge back, as Lord Justice Lindblom has been trying to nudge us all for years, a nudge back towards planning judgment in each case. And then with what Rob was talking about, again, these ideas that you must draw a veil, draw down a line at the base date and so on, again, out the window. What is really needed is some sensible judgment about whether these sites and the units on them are realistically going to contribute to supply. So again, back to judgment. And even Ashley's point about COVID, this idea that there might be a generalised discount available on supply because of the COVID effect. Well, again, too mechanistic, too simplistic. What the Secretary of State, for exactly the reasons Ashley's talked about, I think, wants to say is, look, you're going to have to use judgment. And at the moment, frankly, it's very difficult to form any sensible judgments about the effect of that. So all of this seems to, I think, all three of us, to point back to planning judgment, which may or may not be good news for one side of the debate or the other, but I don't think it lacks clarity. I think it just means we've all got to start using our judgment. Do you want to deal with some questions now? Some of them are typed and we've typed answers. Some of you submitted them in advance. Who wants to go first? Ash and Rob, do you want to come back, unmute yourselves and leap in? I don't know who wants to go first.
I'll just respond briefly to a couple of typed comments. I can't, because I'm hosting, can't type back. But Max Short, who I think mentioned earlier, Joe, makes a very good point and very fair point in relation to the points that I was making, which is that obviously a local planning authority, in fact, an inspector on appeal, has to look at both sides of the equation. Obviously, not just whether a site its deliverability has improved, but also whether sites which were originally considered deliverable are no longer deliverable. And he makes the point that in Woolpit, the authority were looking myopically at one side of that equation. Of course, that is wrong, absolutely wrong. And we all need to look at both sides of the equation. And then Adrian Smith makes a very good point and about windfalls, and that if you are going to take into account permissions granted after the base date, you must make sure that that doesn't duplicate or double count the windfall allowance, whatever that is. And that, again, is a very fair point. I think if it is permissions are granted after the base date and they are within the windfall category, however that is defined, then one shouldn't count those as additional deliverable sites, of course. That would be double counting.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I'll just deal with a couple of points that are kind of tangentially related to the Willows thing, but about the future. So both Matt Evans from Gladman, hi Matt, and Kevin Goodwin, hello, ask about the housing delivery test. And obviously, at the moment, the expectation is, and in fact, the transitional provisions in the NPPF say that in November, the next iteration of the housing delivery test, the threshold will be raised to 75%. And the question is the government going to relax that, basically, because of the difficulty in counting or in basically in delivering houses, slowdown, so on and so forth? I mean, I don't know is the answer. I think it's unlikely. I think the government won't want to be seen to be taking steps which might be seen to be undermining the delivery of housing as a central part of the economic recovery. I don't think it's very likely that they will rewrite the transitional provisions between now and then. I think they've got quite a lot on their plate. I don't think that will be a priority. And of course, the white paper, which actually was it white paper, the policy paper that was published just before COVID, reiterated, although pretended it was a new announcement, that that change was going to happen in November. So it would be quite a major about turn, and I don't think the government's very likely to do that. And then again, the Short family are basically keeping this webinar alive. Another question from Max. about the 2018 based household projections, which came out, I think, earlier this week. You'll all know that standard method is based on the 2014 based household projections published by ONS, which are now getting a bit hoary. Well, they've got 4 years. There are 4 years worth of actual data that they ignore, in effect. Are we going to see the standard method revised to take into account the 2018s? I think, again, unlikely. The government threw the 2016 based projections in the bin because they suggested a lower growth in population than did or slower growth in population and lower than did the 2014s, and that undermined the standard method's ability to get anywhere near 300,000 houses a year. I think I'm right in saying the 2018 projections are a little bit more optimistic than 2016 based, but still plenty less optimistic than the 2014. So I don't think the government will simply move to the 2018s. I think what they'll actually do is revise the standard method. Although I'm told by Ashley, who I don't know, texts senior members of the government or something, that there is going to be a revision to the standard method, but in months, not weeks, whatever that means. So yeah, thank you for those questions.
Thanks, John. I'll just pick up three. I've got. I haven't been clever enough, like you, to draw a sort of coherent parallel between all of them. So I'm just going to take them and answer them. Very interesting as they all are. So the one that's come in just now from Roland Bolton, thank you very much. You say, how can you apply a COVID discount to what is an unrealistic rate for delivery on an existing site? Well, I think that really just comes down to the fact you've got to look at the evidence that's there. If it's unrealistic, well then the local planning authority hasn't shown the necessary clear evidence that the site will be deliverable if it's in a category B. If it's a category A site, a Lim A site, and it's deemed to have the benefit of a presumption it will be deliverable, well then the fact that the projected trajectory is unrealistic is pretty good evidence that it shouldn't be considered deliverable, certainly to its full extent. So I'm not really sure that necessarily COVID plays on either of those things. It just goes back to the central question, as Joe, you mentioned, which is the decision makers got to ask themselves whether there is sufficient evidence that this site will be deliverable to the trajectory that's been included within the council's evidence. And of course, if there was a particular COVID-related issue, like a lockdown that prevented the site being constructed for 3 months, and that had a critical effect on the delivery rates or the implementation of important infrastructure to enable the delivery and completion of housing, well then, again, that would go to the deliverability of the site. Down Bainbridge asked a very interesting question about the tilted balance and suggests, obviously, 5-year supply is one of the express gateways into which you can get into the tilted balance. And he says, well, is it really the tool it used to be to getting permission? And some of us all know that the Gladman have taken a case to the High Court unsuccessfully, where they produced evidence that suggested that in a large number of cases, you were more likely to get planning permission without the benefit of the tilted balance being engaged than with it. And that they extrapolated from that was that the planning inspectorate weren't really applying the tilted balance properly or thoroughly, or as they should be. That was dismissed by the High Court, but it is on its way to the Court of Appeal. So that evidence, I'm sure, will be scrutinised by them, and we shall see what happens. I have to say, in my experience, that in cases where the tilted balance is engaged, it is easier to get permission, unsurprisingly, because those, if I put it this way, sort of more minor levels of harm, which may, in all things being equal, where a spatial strategy is working correctly and delivering a sufficient number of houses, could prevent you getting permission. In a world where it isn't working correctly and not delivering the right number of housing units, well then sort of more minor harms are outweighed by the benefit of boosting significantly the supply of housing. So I think, broadly speaking, it does work. I think in cases where it doesn't work is where sometimes people promoting an application have overlooked some of the paragraph 11D1 situations, the clear reasons where you can refuse permission. Obviously, heritage, green belts, that cases where the tilted balance is temporarily disengaged whilst you apply the policy-specific paragraphs of the framework. Sometimes that can get overlooked or not given enough attention by somebody promoting an appeal, and sometimes you go down before you even get to the tilted balance. So that's a salutary lesson. And then thirdly, finally, a question from Shelley Roos about how does this all apply to annual position statements? Maybe overlapping a bit with your bit of the presentation, Joe, but as I understand it, the annual position statement is simply a method by which the 5-year supply can be officially confirmed, and thereby it is following the same approach to the calculation of a 5-year supply within the structure of a Section 78 appeal. So theoretically, it should be exactly the same. So if it's an open list or not a closed list within the Section 78 context, it is an open list for the purposes of settling an annual position statement, and inspectors determining that would be erring in law to suggest it was a closed list, or at least not following the approach the Secretary of State has suggested as the correct one through this consent order. So I would say that the implications of, Joe, your success range beyond merely the determination of individual applications, but also to the settling of annual position statements. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ash. I've been desperately trying to keep up with the questions that have been coming in as well. There are a few sort of reflecting on where we are now, and I just want to say a last thing about some of those. Nigel DeWitt has been asking a few of them. The basic answer post the Willows is that any site type can potentially qualify as deliverable, but you need in every case to ask, is there evidence that shows that there is a reasonable likelihood of delivery of housing units within the next 5 years? That's the question that needs to be asked. Now, you don't need to ask that question if it's a site type in category A, because the presumption is in your favour, but any other kind of site type, you need to ask yourself, well, is there a realistic prospect? And I think that's the bottom line of the effect of the Willows. And this, sometimes lawyers get obsessed by calling it closed list, open list, those kinds of jargon, but really, as I've probably said enough times already, what we're back to now is a question of planning judgment. Is there a likelihood that there will be units delivered on this site in the next 5 years? It doesn't have to be a certainty. And the kind of evidence that goes to is exactly the kind of evidence that the PPG talks about, both in respect of annual position statements, but also generally progress towards planning application, discharge of conditions, site owner intentions, whether there's a house builder involved, lack of constraints. All of those things are potentially relevant to that question of the realistic prospect. It's impossible to give a ready reckon or a checklist, and if you tick all of them, you're in. It really is a matter of judgment in each case. I don't know if either of you guys want to add anything.
Yeah, if I may, Joe, that's absolutely right. I mean, a large number of participants asked the question, what is expected in terms of clear evidence in order to show it's deliverable? Ian Rowland from Torridge District Council did, but so did Darren Oakley from RPS and Gareth John from Persimmon. And you're right, Joe, it's entirely context dependent. And I hope you don't think that's us ducking the question. But on the one hand, if you've got a site with outline permission, with reserved matters application in the pipeline, with a reputable house builder on board, you may need relatively little, if any, additional evidence to demonstrate clear evidence. If you've got a site which is just merely on the brownfield register, which has some potential issues of contamination and has no house builder on board, then you may need very cogent additional evidence in order to meet the clear evidence threshold. It is entirely context specific. And secondly, the courts have emphasised, and I'm thinking here of the East Berkholt case, the question about whether there's a realistic prospect is a broad concept of policy, and that there's ample scope for planning judgment, and different decision makers can be more optimistic or pessimistic as they wish, so long as they don't fall into irrationality. And so the practical reality is what is clear evidence may be different for one inspector than another inspector. And that's something that I'm afraid is inherent in the planning judgment concept. The only caveat I'd add to that is, of course, if you've got an inspector's decision that something is clear evidence and meets that the realistic prospect threshold, then a later inspector down the line has at least got to grapple with that and take it into account if they're going to depart from that view.
Yeah, all I'd add to that is to say that certainly for the purposes of determining a planning application and a Section 78 appeal, 5-year supply is not an end in itself. It's not the purpose of that exercise. 5-year supply is to guide the exercise of an administrative discretion to grant or refuse planning permission. So it's an aid to taking a decision, not the purpose of the decision. So when you have that firmly in mind, you then look at the evidence that you've got about a 5-year supply. And if, as you say, Rob, the bulk of the 5-year supply is made up of sites that are on a brownfield register, or that they're in the ownership of a land promoter with an outline permission with all other matters reserved, and there's no evidence of a house builder involvement, well, that might well bear on the degree of scrutiny that you apply to the clear evidence to then assist you in taking the decision whether to grant planning permission for the site in front of you. Whereas if you look at the 5-year supply and it's made up of predominantly sites with full planning permission who are, they're already making a start on site and all the issues have been resolved, or that they have outline permission but they're in the hands of an experienced either volume house builder or local house builder, and they know what they're doing and they're getting on, they're communicating with the planning authority, well then again, that may bear on the degree of scrutiny, because it really is supposed to be an aid to taking a decision to see whether to grant planning permission on a site or not, where there are some levels of harm, so not unacceptable harm. You're sort of in the category of sites which are, in normal circumstances, as I say, if the spatial strategy is working correctly, you probably wouldn't be granting planning permission for them because they might be outside a settlement limit, or they may cause a limited amount of harm to the character and appearance of the area. But if looking at the 5-year land supply, it is looking a bit shaky because of what it's made up with, you may then feel that bears stronger on the application of the tilted balance in determining an individual application.
Yeah, I think that's bang on. I think oftentimes we forget, or are able to forget, that the 5-year supply debate is not an end in itself. It's part of the series of steps that lead up to the end, which is the decision of whether or not to grant planning permission. Once you start thinking about why we are interested in 5-year supply, then I think that makes some of these questions a bit easier to answer. It's 12:07, so we've been going for more than the allotted hour. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Thanks, Ash, and thanks, Rob, for coming along and sharing your insights. I've been asked whether the questions and answers that we've dealt with by text can be circulated as well as the recording of the webinar. We definitely can circulate recording of the webinar. I will see if there's a way of downloading or capturing the questions and the answers, and if we can do that, then I'll see if that can be circulated too, because we've dealt with 15 or so that way. But I think all that remains, pending my ability to make that happen, is to say thank you to everybody who attended. We'd all love, I know, to continue the conversation if anybody wants to, so feel free to drop us lines or a line collectively or together, and we'll do our best. But thank you very much, everybody. Have a nice rest of Friday and a good weekend. Thanks very much.